Story Ages of the Earth. Before the dinosaurs. Let's start the story. Everyone slept deeply as the time shuttle sped soundlessly on in time. When they landed, it would be late in the Devonian period, about 360 million years ago. Mike had won a prehistoric world tour for two in a competition. His sister Helen had not really wanted to come. She felt she was a bit old for dinosaurs. In fact, they had not seen a dinosaur yet, but they had come across other strange and terrifying creatures. The expedition was captained by Bob Marsh with Lieutenant Atty Atkins as his second in command. Jenny Andrews was their space-time ranger. She knew almost as much about the prehistoric world as Timcom, the onboard computer, and she was a lot more fun. So far, they had only seen sea creatures because the earliest living things lived only in the water. The land was mostly bare and lifeless. Mike wanted to be the first to spot a real land animal, an amphibian. He thought he had seen one as they took off the day before. That fish thing we saw on the shore as we were taking off, Timcom. What was it? Asked Mike after breakfast. That was Eusthenopteran, a low-fin fish that could live out of water, said Timcom, putting a picture of it on the screen. Why would a fish want to live out of water? Said Helen. That seems silly to me. Well, with so many other creatures in the water, it might have been able to find more food on land, said Timcom. But how could it move and breathe? Asked Mike. Fish have no legs and no lungs. They die out of water. That's true of most fish, said Timcom. But even in our own time, there are some fish that can survive for a time in dried up ponds. They have evolved lungs as well as gills. They can also move about on their fins. A full-grown Eusthenopteron could probably not support its weight on land, but its young might, and on land they would be safe from all the big fish trying to eat them. So that's another reason for a fish to move onto the land. We are about to land ourselves, said Ginny. Still, not many plants, said Helen. As the shuttle touched down, the hills are all bare. There are a lot of more than there, said Jenny. I can't wait to go and have a look at all that greenery by the stream and see if there are any amphibians. You will have to wear life support suits again, said Captain March, just in case the air is not pure enough for you to breathe. And don't be too long. This is only a short stop. We have got a lot more to do today. Jenny, Mike, and Helen climbed into their spacesuits and set off along the course of the nearby stream. The water was full of fish, and for the first time there were creepy crawlies on the ground and plants with stems. They had walked more than a mile when Jenny let out a cry of delight, which the other heard over the intercom. Look, she said. Spawn! In the water was a clump of black spotted jelly, just like frogs' eggs, but bigger. There were also some things like new tadpoles with frilly gills on their heads. Whatever laid those eggs must be around somewhere. Move carefully. We don't want to frighten it, said Jenny. Can you sense where it is, Timcom? she asked the all-knowing computer. No, but I can tell you that the spawn belongs to Ichthyos tiger, the first amphibian we know about. Look for a sheltered place near the water. That's where it will be. And that's where they found it, just crawling out from under a rock. It was green and spotted and about a yard long. They watched the creature until Timcom said it was time to go back. As they walked, Jenny instructed Timcom to photograph certain plants. She explained to the other that nobody knew much about early prehistoric plants. They were too fragile to have fossiled easily. Helen and Mike were not terribly interested in the plants. They wanted their lunch and hurried on ahead. Suddenly, they stopped. "What on earth is that?" shrieked Mike. Across their path crawled a millipede that seemed to go on forever. It was huge. "It's like an endless train. Look at all its legs," said Jenny, catching up with them. "It must be 6 feet long." "One of the larger millipedes," said Timcom. "Its ancestors probably left the water before the fish. Their bodies didn't have to adapt very much for life and on land, and they eat plants, so there is plenty of food for them." "It would make a big enough lunch for us all," said Mike. "Oh," said Jenny, "all right for an amphibian like Ichthyostega, but not for me." After they had eaten lunch, squeezed out of a tube as usual, they got ready to move on the Carboniferous period, a short hop of 20 million years. Now that there was life on land, they had to make sure that they didn't accidentally take any insects or larger creatures with them, for fear of upsetting the balance of nature. After they had checked the shuttle, they took off into Earth orbit and then went into the time mode. As usual, everything went eerily black outside. Jenny and Helen picked up their books, and Mike had a few words with Timcom. "Was Ichthyostega the first land animal?" he asked. "No," said the computer. "That millipede's ancestors probably lived on land long before amphibians evolved. The first land creatures had to rely on plants for food. Amphibians don't eat plants, so they couldn't have evolved until there were enough other creatures for them to eat. It took millions of years. Ichthyostega lived on land, but it had to go back to the water to lay its eggs. And it was tied to the water anyway because of its skin." "What was wrong with its skin?" asked Mike, peering at the picture on the screen. "It wasn't waterproof," said Timcom. "Land animals need waterproof skins to stop their bodies from drying out. That's why you can find amphibians only in damp places." They all got a surprise when they came into land in the Carboniferous period. Everywhere was green, with vast forests and swamps. It was hard to find a place to land. "Be careful when you go out," said Captain Marsh. "The land is often very swampy. Stick to the rocks or place where there are tall trees growing. Wear your lesion-proof undersuits in case you get bitten. There's no need for life support suits anymore. Timcom has tested the air and it's fine." "I think I might stay here and finish my book," said Helen. She didn't like the sound of being bitten. "Come on, Helen," said Mike. It won't be any fun without you, and I need you to hold my hand. Look at the plants, said Jenny as they walked along. We'll get Timcom to tell us about them when we get back, she added, to stop Timcom from launching into a speech. It was difficult to avoid looking at the plants. Some of them were 100 feet tall and they were so thick that the sun could barely penetrate them. In the eerie half light, they could hear insects buzzing and water lapping. Pushing their way toward the light, they came to a clear pool, full of long, thin, withering creatures. Snakes, said Mike. No, said Timcom through the intercom. More amphibians. Snakes are reptiles. Creatures that evolved from amphibians. You won't see reptiles yet. They watched the creatures for a while and then made their way around the pond. A huge dragonfly skimmed across the surface. It was beautiful, but scary. The ground by the pond was a bit soft, so they headed back to the higher, firmer ground. The air was thick with insects. They pinched against the visors of their helmets. Thank heavens for the helmets, thought Helen. Suddenly, Mike screamed again. This time, he had been the first to spot a giant scorpion. It was just by Helen's hand, and the poisonous sting in its tail glistened. I don't like this, said Helen, and she took to her heels. She ran as fast as she could, but the dense undergrowth made speed impossible. She looked back and saw Jenny and Mike, examining the scorpion as though it were a kitten. As she did so, she tripped and fell into the undergrowth. The fronds of a huge fern closed over her. She scrambled to her feet and tried to push the plants away. Ahead of her there was a clear patch of ground. If only she could reach it. She stumbled on and suddenly felt something hit her helmet. She put her hand up to move what she took to be a plant stem, but it wasn't. It was a thread of silk. Looking up, Helen saw that she had stumbled into the lair of a huge, hairy spider. The spider had come out to see what it had caught. Helen backed away and screamed. She had always been scared of spiders, and this one was almost a yard wide. Frozen to the spot, she screamed again. Jenny and Mike were miles away. There was nothing she could do but scream. She had forgotten that Timcom could hear her. The computer had, of course, sounded the alarm immediately, located her, and sent Bob and Attie to help. They arrived to find her still rooted to the spot. Jenny and Mike, having heard the excitement, had hurried to find her as well. Gosh, said Mike, what a beauty! He and Jenny set about examining the spider and getting its vital statistics from Timcom. I think it's time we gave up for today, said Bob. It's getting dark, and I don't suppose you'd like to spend the night in the forest, would you? But we haven't seen everything, pleaded Mike. I've seen quite enough, said Helen. Well, you can stay out for a bit longer, but stay together. Helen should not have been felt alone. Well, I wasn't quite alone, was I? Said Helen. Thanks for saving me, Timcom. You didn't need saving, said Timcom. Spiders don't eat people, and even the scorpion couldn't pierce your suit. After supper, Jenny, Bob, and Helen played cards. Attie updated the log And Mike, as usual, asked Timcom about all the things they had seen. Next morning, he told everyone about the plants and trees they had seen: giant ferns, horsetails, and club mosses. Etty put the shuttle into the hover mode and took them on an early morning tour for the forest. Much of the land was flooded. Trees were uprooted and lying half submerged. "What's happening?" Mike asked Timcom. "What are you looking at? It is a coal swamp," said Timcom. "The trees that fall gradually sink into the mud and decay. Eventually, they will turn into coal," interrupted Helen. She had studied coal at school and liked to show Mike that she knew a thing or two. "How do they turn into coal?" asked Mike. Helen left the explaining to Timcom. "Millions and millions of trees like these died during Carboniferous times, when the land was flooded," said the computer. "Their remains built up in thick layers and formed pit. New plants grew on top of the pit. Then, maybe thousands of years later, the sea flooded the land again. The dumped mud and sand on top of the pit. This heavy weight squeezed the pit until it was almost rock hard. In fact, until it became coal. The coal people burn today is the remains of those giant trees." "Think of that," said Jenny. "When you see coal burning, it was all alive once. Even Helen's spider is now coal." After they had looked at the surface for a while, they found a large area of land that had not been flooded. The plants were flourishing and the sun was high. Jenny and Mike were eager to go out and explore, but it took half an hour to persuade Helen to venture outside again, and even then she would only go with a stun gun to protect herself. They stuck to the high ground, but there was not much to see. So they edged their way down to the shore of a lake and watched the dragonflies. Then they noticed a huge animal on the bank opposite. The creature heaved its way over the ground and slid into the water to catch a fish. "This must be a reptile," thought Mike. "It's at least 15 feet long and it looks like a crocodile." But it wasn't a reptile, it was another amphibian called Eugeirinus. Jenny really wanted to see a reptile. Reptiles first lived in Carboniferous times, but not many of their fossils have been found. She would have loved to have found a living one to film, or even to have discovered some reptile eggs. They watched Eugeirinus for a while, and then Mike noticed another smaller creature. "That could be a reptile," he said. "It's much enough." "Where?" asked Jenny, stepping towards the fallen tree that Mike was pointing at. The little animal was sheltering under it. "It's there," he said, "right at the end." Jenny edges along the trunk, leaning over to try to glimpse the animal. But the trunk could not bear her weight. It tipped up and sank into the swampy edge of the lake. Jenny toppled after it and began to sink. Mike ran toward her, but Helen screamed to him to stop. "Throw something she can hang on to. There's no point in falling in yourself." There was a tree fern bending over the swamp. It bent even more under Mike's weight. as he climbed along it, but he still could not reach Jenny, who was up to her chest in the mud. "Hold on, Jenny!" He shinned down the tree and took off his suit. Then he climbed the tree again and tied the arms of his suit around the trunk so that Jenny was able to catch hold of the legs. But she still could not move. She was safe only as long as the suit and the tree held. "Stay here. I'm going for others," said Helen. "Timcom obviously can't hear what's happened." Helen rushed headlong back the way they had come, leaping over plants and brushing aside the insects and spider in her path. Twice she fell and picked herself up. She must find Bob and Attie. Suppose they were not here. Suppose they were not there. Suppose the shuttle wasn't there. Timcom wasn't working, so anything could have happened. Helen ran on and on, imagining all the worst things that could happen. Then a dreadful thing did happen. A huge armored animal was blocking her path. It was too big to leap over or get around. It had come out from under an overhanging rock to eat the leaf litter. Its chomping jaws were making a dreadful noise. She threw a piece of rock at the creatures, but it would not shift itself. She had dropped her stun gun long before. There was nothing else to do. She would have to climb over it. She worked gingerly toward it, and suddenly it saw her. She froze, but instead of spitting poison at her as she feared it might, it moved slowly back under the ledge. Helen could still see it as she edged past. It made her feel quite sick, but the thought of Mike and Jenny kept her going. She hurtled towards the shuttle, and there at last were Bob and Attie, hurrying to her with a rope. "Of course, Timcom did not break down," said Bob. "It transmitted an alarm as soon as Jenny fell, and we have Timcom's pictures. None of you thought to say what had happened." "We were too busy," said Helen. "Come on, let's hurry. Look out for that great big thing there," she said, as they came up to the creature. Was this the same Helen who was made the spider the previous day? Bob and Attie could not believe their ears. Soon they reached the swamp. Jenny was still hanging for dear life, and Mike was still holding down the tree. Both of them were waiting for the terrible ripping sound of its roots being torn out of the ground. To them, it seemed ages since Helen had gone. In reality, it was only minutes. Jenny had bravely been explaining to Mike that the little creature was not a reptile, but an amphibian called Microbrachius. "It's my fault," she said. "I should have known that a reptile would not have been hiding from the sun. They love the warmth." Attie and Bob threw Jenny and the rope and pulled her out. "You are my fine one to be a ranger," said Bob, hugging Jenny. "You are supposed to stop the others from doing foolish things." Helen held Mike down from the tree, and they all headed back to the shuttle. Suddenly, Mike screamed, "Look at that!" and pointed at the creature, who was once more blocking the path. It was, according to Jenny, who was as enthusiastic as ever despite her ordeal, an arthropleuroid, an extinct creeper that lived on the forest floor. Oh, don't worry about that old thing, said Helen, as they crept past. It won't hurt you. Well, that was the full story before the dinosaurs. So I think you might have enjoyed the full story. The story was really adventurous, right? Now it's your turn to listen to the story again and again so that you can improve your English, sorting out new vocabularies. Now, sort out the new vocabularies to practice and try to apply these new vocabs in your everyday life. And after that, you have to try to tell the story, making summary of the full story. Now, at first try to sort out the new vocabs. After that, try to listen to the story frequently. Then, at last, try to make a summary on your own. Then, you can improve your English properly.